Hello and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So today I'm going to be talking about the Warlords of Draenor Alpha, and more specifically some of the warrior changes that we are initially seeing. Now, these are initial changes. That means that a lot of things are, well, going to be subject to change as we move on. This is only the very first alpha set of patch notes, so obviously there's going to be quite a lot of iteration as we go on. Anyway, so in the video I'm just going to go over the general important things that they mentioned on the blog, then I'll highlight some of the abilities that have been removed, and then the level 90 to 99 perks, and then finally the level 100 talents. Overall, it's actually really interesting, and I'm pretty excited to see how warriors are going to actually play. So first of all, Blizzard said that they were not happy with the arms warrior rotation. So what they've done is they've actually made a bunch of changes, primarily through cutting some abilities. So for example, Cleave is gone, Whirlwind is Fury only, and there may be one or two other changes. I'll detail them later when I go over the removed abilities though. So that's interesting. Hopefully arms might just feel a little bit more refined, though personally I've never had much of a problem with the arms rotation, just from a PvP perspective, though perhaps it has some PvE issues that I'm not aware of. Alright, so next they said that they've also reduced cooldown stacking for the class by removing Skull Banner and then rolling some of its functionality into Recklessness. And this also, well, this is interesting because without the banner you won't be able to intervene to your banner, so certainly an interesting change. Maybe there's a thing lost there, but maybe that's the kind of thing which could be fixed in a future iteration of a talent or something like that. Now, they've also changed things up with Throw. Throw is actually gone, but to compensate for this, they have actually changed the cooldown for Heroic Throw all the way down to 6 seconds. Also, Recklessness now increases your critical hit chance by 10% down from 30, and then increases your critical hit damage by 10%, well, from 0%. They are also rolling in some of the Skull Banner functionality into Recklessness, so it's really going to be the functionality of 2 buttons in one, which is going to be nice from a complexity standpoint. And then finally, Shattering Throw is going to be a glyph that can be learned by any warrior spec, and the only thing that it will be able to do is damage to your opponent, and then it will break their immune. Also, there are some very interesting changes to haste, and these are actually changes which kind of go hand in hand with some of the stat changes that I mentioned earlier in the video. It's about 2 or 3 videos back. It's about primary stats, and that also covers haste because of how it's being calculated. But essentially what's happening now is that haste has just been a bit of a long-standing issue with warriors because it wasn't very good. It was essentially just a bad stat. There wasn't a decision there, you never wanted it. So what they've done is they've given warriors a new passive which is called Headlong Rush. This will decrease the cooldown of Mortal Strike, Bloodthirst, Shield Slam, and Thunderclap. This basically means that the main bread and butter parts of your rotation should actually feel a little bit more snappy as time goes on. And I'd be very interested in seeing what this is like for cooldowns, really, and just how much you can decrease your cooldown, because maybe it could be like to a rotation changing point, and I think that might be kind of interesting. Then they've also redesigned Riposte. This is, of course, a protection thing, but it basically gives you a 100% chance to parry after getting an auto attack crit, with the 100% chance applying for your next parry only. This is just once again a way of making sure that all stats are useful to pretty much every spec. So if you are a prot tank and you have some crit in your gear, well, that's actually going to aid your survivability as well. Alright, so they've also done some changing around with talents. First of all, they've actually changed Second Wind. They're basically going to make it so that it grants you a 10% lifesteal instead. This basically means that you need to actively fight your opponent rather than just running away to wait for Second Wind to regenerate. So the interplay between them, well, I just think that could be interesting, and perhaps some people might want to maybe save Recklessness for whenever they're going to be within Second Wind range, that like 35%, so that they can get more health from it. I'm not too sure how that'll work with balance, but it's certainly very interesting, and I think I prefer that form of gameplay as well. Then they've also swapped Bladestorm and Stormbolt, meaning that Bladestorm is level 90 talent, and Stormbolt is level 60 talent. Essentially, they just thought that those talents made more sense swapped around, in comparison to the other talents that are within those tiers. Okay, so next up on our list of changes, they have messed around with the spell effects, or more the UI effects, for Blood Surge and Raging Blow. Basically, Blood Surge will take the top slot of the spell alert kind of section in your UI, and Raging Blow will take the left and right slots. Basically, they just think this will make it easier to see when these abilities proc. So, fair enough, and that just sounds like a nice usability change. Okay, so then they have changed Enrage a little bit. It will increase all damage rather than just physical damage, and this is because one of the level 100 talents actually does fire damage, and this also applies to the Fury Mastery. It will increase all damage, not just physical. Then finally they have changed up Deep Wounds a little bit. It will now last for 15 seconds or until the target is fully healed, so this is mainly a PvP balance decision, and it shouldn't really affect PvP all that much. So with that covered, let's talk about the removed abilities. This is a bit of an interesting one. So, Charge actually roots the target instead of doing a stun and doesn't share a diminishing return with anything else. That's certainly interesting. It still means that Charge is very strong, though because it's not a stun, your enemy will still be able to fight while rooted. This is actually something that they were going to do in patch 5.4.7, but they decided that they didn't really, they just didn't want to make like that kind of change mid-expansion, basically. So that's rather interesting. Somewhat related to that last change is Warbringer. It will now actually do a 1.5 second stun instead of a root. This means that Warbringer is actually significantly, well, it's very strong now. That's actually it's a big effect, I guess. So that's definitely nice. Yeah, good stuff. Then also Disarm has been removed. That's a very interesting one for PvP. I'm not too sure how that'll pan out in terms of balance. And then also Intimidating Shout has now got a 6-second duration in PvP, which is down from 8 seconds. Then also, Battle Shout will now last for an hour and no longer generate any rage. This means that it's just a passive buff, it doesn't really have a part of combat, and I think that's okay because I didn't particularly enjoy the Shout's mechanics, so I think that's actually grand. Then also, Berserker Rage no longer actually generates rage or increases physical damage dealt, and Berserker Stance has been removed. Also, Cleaves has been removed, and of course in line with that Battle Shout change, Commanding Shout also will now last for an hour and not generate any rage. Also, Demoralizing Banner has been removed. Then Hamstring is actually now a passive ability that causes Mortal Strike, Bloodthirst, Revenge, and Raging Blow to reduce the target's movement speed by 50% for 15 seconds. 15, wow. Hamstring's very powerful now because you won't actually have to think to put it on, it'll just be done by your main bread and butter abilities. I think that's a very interesting change, actually. It's going to make fighting against the warrior in melee a very interesting thing. Like, if we can catch up to one or two of those ranged classes, you know, with that strong slow, I think it could be very powerful. So that's definitely a change that I think we'll need to go through quite a lot of iteration when we get into the full-on testing process. Then also, Rallying Cry is no longer available to Protection Warriors, and Recklessness is only available to Fury and Arms Warriors. Also, Skull Banner has been removed, Throw has been removed, Thunderclap is no longer available to Fury Warriors, and Whirlwind is now only available to Fury Warriors. So I think overall these are rather reasonable changes. The loss of the banner could perhaps be a little bit of a loss of depth for some players, so we'll have to see how that plays out, and I'm sure that if Blizzard feel that something meaningful has been lost, then they will put it back in some way, or maybe just, I don't know, make some sort of talent that would give you the same functionality. I kind of like the idea, but still, I suppose you'll be able to intervene to a friendly party member anyway, so maybe they could just be trying to emphasize the actual group positioning in PvP, rather than just like intelligently placing one of your banners and then just fighting around that banner. That's definitely a more subjective change though, in my opinion. Alright, so let's finish off the video by talking about the perks and talents. So first of all, perks. You get these from level 91 to 99. You'll unlock one of them per level in a random order, and by the time you hit level 100, you'll have one of all of them. And in terms of what these perks do, well, they sometimes give you just the flat damage increase to some spells, functionality increases and that kind of thing. So let's just have a look at Arms for an example. Improved Charge increases the range of charge by 10 yards, and Improved Heroic Leap increases the damage radius by 2 yards. A lot of things that kind of make sense for me within the sort of aspect of Arms. And then of course a lot of the Arms abilities like Overpower, Slam, Mortal Strike, Colossus Smash have all just kind of had some sort of buff to them. So this should definitely be very powerful, and actually empowered Execute. Wow, 50% extra damage in Execute? That's really cool. Now, of course, all these numbers will be balanced by the time we hit endgame and get our way through the testing process. I don't think you have to worry about little things like this just absolutely, unbalancing the game. They will pay attention to balance, and in fact, quite a lot of underlying statistic changes in Warlords have been very much focused on allowing them to easily tune balance. Alright, so next, when we move on to Fury, we really see lots of similar things. It's just the base bread and butter abilities being buffed up, and what that's going to mean is just that when you play Fury, it's perhaps going to feel a little bit more fun, and I think that's absolutely a good thing, really. These perks aren't necessarily meant to completely redefine how you play your class every time, but what they are meant to do is just provide you with a tangible increase in power from level to level as you approach 100, so that there's constantly something cool and interesting happening, and because there's a random order, well, everyone's going to experience that a little bit differently. So I think that actually, for a leveling perspective, they're kind of interesting, and then of course by the time everyone hits level 100, they all should be quite balanced. Alright, so next for protection, we once again just see kind of the regular things, but things like, say, shield barrier now having an increased absorb by 10%, just general things like that. It's what you'd expect. Not going to really go into much detail here because you can read it in the screen. But overall, my thoughts on these perks are that they should just make your class's core abilities feel good, and hopefully not be balanced, and then just give you these nice little rewards as you level up. So next, let's have a little bit of a talk about talents. Now, Arms and Fury actually share talents. And the ones you have is Anger Management, which is rather interesting because every 30 rage you spend, you actually decrease the cooldown of your readiness affected abilities by 1 second. If you don't know what readiness is, it's actually a new secondary stat. So something like Recklessness, well, the cooldown of Recklessness would be decreased when you have readiness. And readiness is just a thing that you can get in gear, which is kind of interesting. So Anger Management, definitely a cool way of doing that. It means that the more rage you spend, the faster you get your big CDs up again, and that should be kind of fun. Then, of course, we have Ravager. This is from our good friend General Nazgrim. It basically just throws a whirling axe at the location, does X amount of damage every second for 8 yards, and it also, interestingly enough, increases your chance to parry by 20% for 15 seconds. I don't know if that fits too well, but I mean, hey, it's an extra bit of functionality, so perhaps that could be of interest to people. And then the one that is Arms and Fury specific is Ignite Weapon. So you ignite your weapon, making it do 100% fire damage, all its damage as fire, and then it causes your auto attacks to deal damage, fire damage for 10 seconds. It's not on the global cooldown, and this will actually replace Heroic Strike. So it's basically a better Heroic Strike. That should hopefully just make these rotations a little bit more interesting, because, I don't know, like, do you really use Heroic Strike that often, apart from when you really need to get rid of Rage? I'm not too sure. I know that in a PvP capacity, you basically never use Heroic Strike, so maybe this will be a little bit more interesting in that regard. Now, for Protection Warriors, you actually have the exact same in terms of Anger Management and Ravager, but what's interesting is the Gladiators ones. So, you will choose this one Gladiator's ability, and with that you get two things, Gladiator's Resolve and Gladiator Stance. Now, Gladiator's Resolve pertains to Defensive Stance, and it will increase your damage reduction by 5%, and you also, though, are able to swap over to a new stance called Gladiator Stance. This will replace Battle Stance, and it's described as a dauntless combat stance that increases your physical damage dealt by 20% and replaces your shield block with shield charge. And you cannot change in and out of this stance during combat. This is very interesting, actually. This, I guess, is a little bit like a PvP version of Prod, or maybe if you're raiding and well, you might need to do some more damage, perhaps Gladiator Stance could be the thing for you. Though not being able to swap back does certainly limit some of its PvE viability, I might imagine anyway. Still though, it's a highly interesting talent, and it's certainly one that is going to fundamentally change how the specialization is played. I think talents like that, and perhaps the, what's the one? The Hunter one, which involves forgoing your pet. I think that they're really interesting, and I hope that they do more of those with more classes, just so that people can have a little bit more variation. Okay, so let's move on to Glyphs, and as you can see, one of those Glyphs is particularly interesting, the Glyph of Cleave. It basically puts Cleave's functionality back into Heroic Strike. I think this is a really good example of an item squish done right. They just augment an older ability with the useful part of one that has been removed, and overall that should just give you a more interesting gameplay experience, and it just makes Heroic Strike a little bit different. And I think that's a really good way of doing it. So overall, you're not going to lose out on that functionality as long as you use that Glyph. Though hopefully there's not some sort of like, well, just in terms of balance, let's hope it all works out okay with some Glyphs not being completely mandatory. Anyway, so that is it for the Glyphs. Alright, so overall, what do I think? Well, first of all, I think that we do need to wait to see how all of these changes play out, especially with things like the war banners. But overall, the ideas I think are pretty solid. Right now, when I play an Arms Warrior in PvP, I've got over 30 buttons, and actually I need 1 or 2 more. Honestly, like, that's sort of unfeasible to do on a regular keyboard. I'm okay. I have a Razer Naga. That's 24 buttons on my thumb, plus I actually can use an alt modifier if I really want to, but it's probably not the most ergonomically, like, correct. Still though, I have access to a lot of buttons, but that's because I have an expensive mouse. Perhaps a lot of people don't, and maybe just toning down the amount of abilities just a bit will help with PvP in general. And then, of course, for PvE, which is really my main thing over on my Hunter, but not for my Warrior, I think that these changes should just make more fun rotations if they do it all right, and they really balance out those perks well. And then, of course, those level 100 talents do look pretty interesting, though I think there's definitely more there for the Prot Warriors, because Gladiator's Resolve and Gladiator Stance just seem really damn cool, don't they? I think that's, it's kind of awesome. So in terms of other things, well, I really like this haste change. I think that it's going to give a really tangible reward for getting haste in your gear, and it should of course be balanced out with everything else, but I think it's damn cool actually, so props to Blizzard for trying to do something interesting with haste, and fixing the problem that Warriors have traditionally had with haste. I think that's really quite good. Yeah, I think that's really my general thoughts. Overall, they're pretty positive, though, of course, I just can't wait to get into the testing for the game and actually give some of these changes a whirl. Once I do get to do them, you know, of course, you'll get a video with my sort of personal hands-on impressions and then a bit of gameplay. But that all, of course, depends on actually getting into the alpha, so we'll see how all that works out. Still though, do post your first impressions, and just remember that these changes are not the sort of thing that you can take in context to patch 5.4.7 and the current balance. The whole face of the game and the face of many different classes will be completely different. There are a lot of spec changes, there are a lot of stat changes, there's new stats being added. You can't just think that, oh, they've removed my banners, this means when I, you know, insert yourself into a common arena scenario in patch 5.4.7 that you'll be worse off. It won't mean that, because everything's relative. Anyway, so that is it for our at least preliminary alpha findings for the Warrior. Stay tuned to the channel. Once more things come out, I will be sure to cover them pretty much as soon as possible. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.